Well, today on the show, I'm delighted to welcome back Professor Philp Goff. I spoke to Philip about 18 months ago, before he had released his book, Why? The Purpose of the Universe. And in that conversation, we spoke about God, arguments for and arguments against, as well as a host of other subjects around that space. I picked up his book, Why? The Purpose of the Universe, and thought it'd be great to have him back on the show to talk about the other subjects within that space that kind of add to that conversation. So we look at things like value, whether it's subjective, fundamental, or a nihilistic theory. We look at things like morality. We look at the idea of purpose being fundamental to everything. It's a really interesting conversation that dives into its own nuances and facets. And I think it's well worth your time. If you haven't checked out my first conversation with Philip, that will be linked in the description. It's not a requirement. You can get through this perfectly fine without diving into that. But if you want the whole picture, it's well worth listening to both of these side by side. If it's your first time checking out the show, I'd ask you to hit the subscribe button, and then if you're on YouTube, select the bell notification icon. That will remind you whenever we release a video here on the channel. And if you wouldn't mind giving this video a thumbs up and then sharing it with your friends, family, followers. As I've always said, we grow because you take the time to share this content. So please think whoever you believe would find this to be a helpful conversation, go ahead then and share that with them. Okay, enough of that. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Professor Philp Goff as we dive further into his book, Why? The Purpose of the Universe. Cheers. Hello and welcome to the show. My name's Samuel, and today I'm joined once again by Professor Philp Goff. Philip, it's great to have you back on the show.
Hello, Samuel. Good to see you again. Looking forward to chatting.
Yeah, we had a really interesting conversation about 18 months ago now, before your book had gone live, talking about fine-tuning and the problem of evil and all of that stuff. And obviously since then, your book, Why? The Purpose of the Universe, has gone live. So two questions just to get us off the bat. How have you been keeping? And also, how have things gone with the book launch? Like, what's the sort of receptiveness been like for a book like that?
I'm doing pretty good, actually. Yeah, I think it had a good reception. It was pretty crazy hectic before Christmas. It came out in November. Did a few book launches one in Durham, one in Edinburgh, one in Oxford with the novelist Philip Pullman. And yeah, one sign that's quite interesting actually that occurred to me about 11 years ago, the philosopher Thomas Nagel brought out a book called Mind and Cosmos, arguing for something kind of similar, arguing for cosmic goal-directedness, a sort of teleology in nature, or at least exploring that possibility. And he got absolutely hammered in reviews. It was said, oh, he's lost the plot. He's a really establishment, respectable, influential philosopher. Now, my book hasn't got anything like that. And I don't think it's because I'm a better philosopher. Just to be clear, I think he's a better philosopher than me by far, but just shows us a greater openness to these ideas. I've got positive reviews in British newspapers, Guardian, Times Literary Supplement, and big newspapers in lots of other countries around Israel, lots of other European countries. 5-star review in Popular Science. I'm not just saying that to boast. Popular Science magazine. Not just saying that to boast. I'm partly saying it to boast, but it's kind of odd in a Popular Science magazine that most of the reviews, I should say, were like, didn't agree with a word of this, but it's a good book, which is fair enough. But yeah, so it's gone pretty well. Yeah, I'm just enjoying now, actually, a bit more calm this in 2024, and getting back to doing some academic writing, meeting students. A bit of a quieter. Well, it's still crazily hectic, but a bit less of that. But still keeping a hand in with the podcasts, and it's good to be doing one again.
Yeah. I'm always impressed by the fact that you obviously an academic, right? You're teaching, you're studying, you're releasing papers, you've got students, you've got that entire world, which is a minefield. You're writing books for general audiences as well. You run a podcast, and you're on Twitter. As far as I can tell, most of the day, like I don't know how you do it all. Basically, it's very impressive.
Well, thank you. Well, actually, I've got a grant at the moment. I've got this 3-year grant to try and work out if the universe is conscious. Well, I sort of jokingly say that it's on a Panpsychism meets Panentheism. So,
Nice.
I've defended Panpsychism and philosophy of mind. My co-PI, as the terminology is, the person who's running the project with me is Andrei Bukharev from Marist College in the US, who's defended Panentheism in the philosophy of religion. So we're exploring the connection, and so that gives me a lot of teaching relief, and the public engagement's got bigger and bigger. I don't know how I'm going to go back to like a full teaching load. Actually, start doing loads of school talks as well, sort of in the UK. Awarded a prize recently for year 10 students writing on panpsychism, and so I'm hoping to just keep applying for grants so I can so I don't run myself into the ground. But yeah, it is a bit hectic with kids as well, so work hours are tightly prescribed, but I'm absolutely loving it. The only complaint, a bit too busy, always trying to cut things down, but yeah, it's all really good fun. It's good to reach out to an audience, not just academics talking to each other, talking to themselves.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah, and obviously I appreciate your time for this show. So let's dive into it then. So I've obviously read your book, Why, before we had a conversation I've already mentioned about 18 months ago. For the listener and viewer, if you wanted to look at that first, it will be linked in the description. So check that out, because this conversation is probably going to build on quite a lot of those elements, although it will be tackling new stuff as well that you kind of talked about in the book itself. So you kind of talk about this concept of a cosmic purpose. I've got kind of quite a few questions that are going to kind of feed into the sort of, I guess, the narratives around sort of panpsychism and pan-agentialism, or however we pronounce it. We can get to that in due course, and then other bits and pieces. So as we move through this, I think it'd be helpful just to kind of slowly build upon these different themes. So to begin with, could you kind of outline for us this idea of a sort of cosmic purpose?
So what I call cosmic purpose is just the idea that there's some kind of goal directedness at the fundamental level of reality, which I suppose contrasts with our more standard scientific picture since the scientific revolution, where what happens is just determined by mathematical laws, and what happens at any given moment is just completely fixed by what happens the moment earlier. So it's sort of going from past to future. The idea of cosmic purpose is that actually what's happening is, at least in part, fixed by the need to aim at some future goal, such as the emergence of life, the emergence of higher forms of consciousness, whatever it might be. Perhaps the most familiar way of making sense of cosmic purpose is God. That God's designed the universe with a purpose in mind, and maybe fiddles with it every now and then. That is one form of cosmic purpose, but I have worries about the God hypothesis as well. And so what I try to do in the book, basically argue that there's challenges for the traditional atheist picture that there's no cosmic purpose. We just live in a meaningless, purposeless universe. On the other hand, there's challenges for the religious idea that there is cosmic purpose, and we make sense of that with God. And so we need to explore a sort of middle ground options where there is cosmic purpose, but we don't account for that in terms of the traditional God. And I explore a few different hypotheses and ways to try and make sense of that, and then explore its implications, if any, for human meaning and purpose, for dessert.
Okay, that's really interesting. So in your book, you kind of speak a little bit about your sort of journey to value fundamentalism. You speak about how you kind of started off being a value subjectivist, and then moved into value nihilism, and then kind of, it almost feels like you came to value fundamentalism, kind of resisting that sort of pull towards it, but actually landing and having to follow where you believe the evidence stands. I think it'd be really helpful to kind of sketch this journey out for the listener, kind of why value subjectivism wasn't enough, why value fundamentalism became the thing you went to, and why value nihilism is just a place that you found it utterly impossible to live in.
Yeah, thanks. I get a bit autobiographical at this stage of the book. This is in one of the digging deeper sections, so each chapter has a sort of more accessible bit and then a digging deeper bit, getting a bit more into the technical details. But yeah, I guess when I was an undergraduate and a teenager, I was a big fan of David Hume's moral philosophy, very influential 18th century Scottish philosopher. And I guess on the Hume picture of things, human motivation just bottoms out in certain brute desires. There's just certain things you want to do, certain life goals. And Hume famously said, "Reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions." So reason can't assess whether your fundamental life goals are better or worse. So whether your basic life goal is making everyone happier, or stamp collecting, or torturing children, whatever your fundamental life goal, reason can't say, oh, that's better, that's worse. Reason just tells you how to achieve your goals. So that was basically the picture I thought made a lot of sense to me. And then slowly, I guess, a couple of issues arose with it. One is, well, there seemed to be a tension in at least a tension in the David Hume picture as I had understood it. I don't sort of get into Hume's scholarship in the book. People disagree on how to interpret Hume. All I talk about in the book is how I understood Hume and the picture, the moral philosophy I'd adopted. I mean, because there seemed to be a tension with another bit of Hume's moral philosophy. Hume famously said, "You can't get an ought from an is." And what he meant by that is you can't go from facts that aren't about value to facts that are about value. So I can't go from, the fact that this person is suffering to the fact that I ought to help them. Right, that's going from a fact claim to a value claim, and Hume said that's a sort of non sequitur. But what kind of dawned on me one day is that Hume seems to make an ought claim when he says reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions. And how I'd always interpreted that is that what you ought to do is determined by your desires, by what you want to do. So if I want to collect stamps, then that's what I should do. And reason can tell me how best to do that. If I want to torture children, that's what I should do. Horribly speaking, sounds horrible, but that's the basic idea, that your basic desires are what you determine what you ought to do, and reason just tells you the best way to do that. But that in itself seems to imply a move from an is to an ought, right? That I want to collect stamps, therefore that's what I ought to do. So if it's problematic to move from is to an ought, from non-value to value, why is that more problematic when it's going from my desires to what I ought to do, rather than, say, someone else's desires to what I ought to do, or the fact that someone's suffering to what I ought to do? In both cases, you're going from non-value to value. There seems a sort of contradiction there. So that was a sort of technical worry that just thought, oh my God, this whole thing is kind of incoherent, at least the Hume-inspired moral philosophy I'd learned to adopt. And I find it a lot, actually, arguing about value objectivity on Twitter. People do think, oh yeah, I don't believe in value, but they still think there's things they ought to do. They believe in subjective value, but in a way, that's a kind of objective value. If you think like what you desire determines what you should do, that's a kind of value objectivism. It's just that the objective values are exclusively determined by your own desires. But why is that any weirder? Why is that any less weird than values being determined by someone else's desires or something. So that's one sort of technical, is this inconsistent kind of thing. But the other thing was just really finding it harder and harder to swallow this idea that all life goals are on a par. So I mean, I talk in the book about, imagine someone whose fundamental life goal is counting blades of grass. And crucially, they don't enjoy it, right? They maybe they hate it, or maybe they've just got no interest. But that's just their, people can have life goals that they don't enjoy. You might, pursue a life of art or science that you find painful, but you value it. So this person just values counting blades of grass for its own sake, and they sweat and toil and cheat and do everything they can just to make sure as many blades of grass are counted as possible before they die. And the idea that that is just on a par with curing cancer, or or just making yourself or your family and friends happier, the idea that all these things are just on a par seems to me self-evidently false. And I argue about it, and some people say, no, I don't think that is false. But in philosophy, all you can ever do is start with what seems to you most evident. And the idea that, some things are more worth doing than others, that seems to me as evidently true as, there is this table in front of me. So then at the end of the day, I suppose I thought, well, if the whole David Hume subjectivism doesn't make sense, the alternative seemed to me, well, there's just no value, right? There's no facts about value. It's all just an illusion of some kind. And I tried to live that out for quite seriously for a long time. But it gets trickier. I think a lot of people who say, oh, I don't believe in value, again, they're just thinking of, say, moral value. Maybe the fact that murder's wrong, that's just a projection of our negative emotions towards it. The fact that love is good is just a projection of what we like. But they don't take into account how pervasive value claims are in our discourse and our thought. Think about value to do with evidence, that you ought to follow the evidence, that you ought not to believe contradictory ideas, or just self-interested prudential oughts, like if I'm in terrible pain, I should, try to remedy the situation. So really trying to embrace out and out nihilism, that there is we have no reason to think or do anything, is just practically unlivable, I think. Because I disagree with Hume on our motivation. I don't think human motivation just bottoms out in these brute drives. I think often we do things because we judge that we have reason to do it, that it's worth doing. Whether that's something grand like scientific advancement, or whether it's just, I'll enjoy this meal on the menu, and so that gives me reason to do it. I think human motivation is thoroughly wrapped up in value, and so it's just value nihilism is just unlivable. So I ended up, to cut a long story short, there are other options on the map here. It's a very complicated field, but being some kind of value fundamentalist, that there are just fundamental facts about good and bad, what is worth doing and what is pointless. And that's very hard to make sense of metaphysically. How can reality make that true? How do we know about these things? And I'm not sure I've got all the answers to that, but that's where I sit at the moment. Sorry, that was very long-winded.
No, it was really interesting. So I've got a kind of an off-script question then, which I think might help people to kind of get their head around this a little bit more. So let's start with this idea of kind of value. Obviously, other creatures can also, if we're speaking about value being a fundamental property, other creatures could theoretically also be kind of moving towards or being involved with this sort of value theory. So you could think of something like let's use a Tyrannosaurus Rex, right? An extinct creature finding value in raising their offspring and hunting as a pack, and they're loving and killing and living as a group, and eventually are extinct. So that's an example, another example, and to bring it close to home is humans. We are engaging in these different things, whether it be curing cancer or counting blades of grass. If you kind of stretch the time period far enough, everything kind of comes into question in regards to, was what I would do, is anything that I do valuable at a fundamental level if it's going to end in, the heat death of the universe, say, if we stretch time scales that far. So the sort of question, I guess, to kind of help people understand why value fundamentalism could still hold even if heat death of the universe is the state we're going to end up in. Kind of what makes the decisions we make today, given the end of everything for all of us, we're going to die eventually, but humanity itself could or probably will go extinct someday. Sorry to break the bad news to everybody. So what makes it so that value transcends us or transcends the Tyrannosaurus Rex or whatever it is? Kind of what is it that gives value the ability to transcend or be fundamental or something we build our value upon?
Good. I mean, I certainly agree that this isn't just something human beings do. I think there's a long trajectory of people starting to think, oh, only human beings have these special things. Only human beings have consciousness. Only human beings have agency. And over time, I think not just philosophers, but scientists also have come to appreciate that these special features are much more widespread than we previously thought. So yeah, but I think it's important to distinguish two different questions here. One, does the universe have a purpose, a goal? Is there somewhere it's going? That's one question. Another question is the question of objective value. Do things have inherent significance, value, meaning? I think these two things can separate. Someone like William Lane Craig thinks they hang and fall together. If there's no point to the universe, it's all pointless, meaningless, worthless. But I'm more on the secular atheist side with this one. I think, even if it's all going to come to nothing, even if there's no purpose beyond the human or the biological realm, nonetheless, in the present moment, it seems clear that our lives can have inherent value and significance through how we choose to live. If we do things that are worth doing, that are, in my view, objectively worth doing, like kindness, creativity, the pursuit of knowledge, I think these things have inherent value, even if their effects are only temporary. Where I depart perhaps from certain secular atheists is that I think if there is some kind of cosmic purpose, which is the idea I take seriously in the book, there's perhaps the potential for more meaning, more significance. But nonetheless, some kind of significance is not, it doesn't hang or fall with there being a purpose to the universe.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I get so many theists that I speak to when it comes to fundamental properties such as morality or value or things like this. It's almost because we are to partake in the expression of that in its completion, and they would point to something like God as the Trinity as the sort of perfect loving unity of Spirit, Father and Son, and they would say that we are able to, as image bearers, partake in this unity of complete love and value, morality, these sorts of things. Are being played out in sort of minor keys in our life to the major song, which is the sort of kind of Trinitarian view of Christianity, potentially. Or you can swap this out for Islam or whatever, but there's this idea that there is this deity that means that because it is going to be a permanent fixture that we are, as conscious agents, able to partake in, that makes it fundamental. But what you're saying seems to be slightly different, which is totally fine and really interesting. I kind of wanted to push a little bit as well and just find out when you were kind of looking at this idea of value fundamentalism and cosmic purpose, how did you land at these two? Did you land at cosmic purpose first and then value fundamentalism, or value fundamentalism first and then cosmic purpose? Or like, just sketch out for me the sort of journey between believing these two things are properties that are true.
That's a good question, because I do think these are separate things. The value fundamentalism definitely came first, as I outline in the book. I think early in my graduate study, I had this radical conversion to value fundamentalism, talking to, I wasn't doing a moral philosophy PhD, I was doing consciousness, but Reading University, where I did my PhD, there are a lot of great moral philosophers there, like Jonathan Dancy, who's one of the few philosophy professors to have been on a primetime American chat show, which you can YouTube, is because he is the father-in-law of Claire Danes, the actress from Homeland, among other things. Anyway, and Philip Stratton Lake, who sadly passed away too young quite recently. But some great moral philosophers who really woke me from my dogmatic slumbers. But, value fundamentalism may sound odd to certain people, but it's actually a fairly mainstream position. People might be interested to look at the Phil Papers survey of English-speaking philosophers' opinions throughout the world on different philosophical matters. So yeah, it's quite mainstream. Not, there's plenty of opposition, but to think that that there are objective, in some sense, fundamental facts about value. And it's not a position anymore that's wrapped up with religion. There's plenty of secular atheists. Derek Parfit was a very influential philosopher. Scanlon, Thomas Nagel, although he's a bit more fruity on my side these days. But anyway, there's lots of people who think of themselves. Well, Peter Singer actually, has people who are more likely to have heard of, has come to this direction of strong moral objectivism as he's got older, influenced by some of the names I've just talked about. So yeah, so that's not that's a much more mainstream position. Belief in cosmic purpose is a much more non-standard position, and it's a much more recent thing for me. If you want the autobiography, just briefly, I think it was just coming to Durham and university where I teach now, and being asked to teach philosophy of religion, and you know the standard course, you teach the arguments against God, you teach the arguments for God, and the students have to decide which are more compelling and write their essay. And I taught the arguments against God, and I was like, yeah, very convincing, definitely no God. But then I taught some of the arguments for God, in particular the fine-tuning argument, and I was like, my God, this is pretty convincing as well. So I was sort of like I don't mind changing my mind if it seems to me the evidence or the arguments have changed, but it seemed to be powerful arguments pushing in two directions, for and against God. And then I sort of had a eureka moment where it just was obvious actually that actually these weren't pushing in contradictory directions, that the traditional arguments against God were arguing against a very specific kind of God, the all-knowing, all-powerful, perfectly good, supernatural being, whereas the arguments, quote unquote, for God were for something much more generic, something God-ish, some kind of goal-directedness. So I thought, if you can have goal-directedness without the traditional God, then you can have your cake and eat it. And 5 years later, I got this book. But yeah, I was kind of more. You said I was drag kicking and screaming into moral objectivism, which I guess is true to an extent. I was about like 22 or something at that point, but I would say much more with this cosmic purpose, because it is a more unusual position. I still feel silly talking about it. I still feel embarrassed talking about it, to be honest. And that's how paradigms work, don't they? That they maintain, continuity, because people feel silly if they say something a bit different. And I suppose if you're arguing for God, then you've got the safety blanket of, the religious community or religious philosophers who will, it's acceptable what you say. But if you don't even have that, it's a bit tricky. So yeah, it was a few years of saying, do I really think this? Do I really, to get into that one.
I want to invite you to join our community on Locals. There is a range of free and supporter-only benefits to check out. On Locals, you can ask guest questions, access the reading plan to prepare for upcoming conversations, get early access to all the full-length video and audio versions of each episode, and meet like-minded followers of the show. The link is in the description, and I hope to see you there. So a bit of a sort of curveball, and this is mainly because I've been reading about Platonism quite a lot recently, in kind of preparation for other guests. Do you think that sort of kind of like abstract Platonic properties could also kind of count or bolster the sort of case that you put forwards in your book, Why? I'm aware we're going to dive into some more of the details in due course, but I thought it'd be interesting to ask you kind of why you kind of stayed or steered clear of speaking so much about kind of Platonism and how that could, I guess, build in a framework which has kind of fundamental properties, the sort of ones that you're addressing here. So kind of why did you kind of, steer not completely away, but fairly clear of that subject?
No, I think I would embrace some kind of Platonism. If that just means the facts about value are in a sort of timeless, eternal realm of some kind, not realm in the sense of physical space. But I mean, I share the Platonist view that I think what's going on with mathematics and what's going on with value is somehow the same. It's somehow metaphysically the same kind of thing. And that's partly what makes me feel less worried about my value realism. There are deep questions about how we make sense of objective value. How could it be? How can reality fix what's right and wrong, good or bad? And also, how do we know about these things? But I think you've got kind of the same thing in mathematics. We seem to have these objective truths of mathematics and logic that my colleagues in other departments take themselves to be discovering. How do we learn about this timeless realm of mathematics? We know how we learn about the physical world very roughly with light bouncing off things going in your eyes, but how does the brain get impacted by this transcendent realm of mathematics? The great physicist Roger Penrose has been very good at outlining this, as pressing this as one of the big mysteries. So whatever you say about mathematics, so even though there's deep challenges with value, I think those challenges reoccur in the case of mathematics. So if we can find a solution for the mathematical case, we can find it for the value case too. And part of the reason we're stuck with that with mathematics, I think, is there used to be a project in the 20th century of trying to explain mathematics in terms of logic, but I think Gödel's incompleteness theorem kind of puts pay to that, because that, roughly that shows that there are, for any kind of algorithm, you're not going to be able to generate all the truths of arithmetic from that algorithm. And therefore there must be some mathematical truths that don't just follow from logic and axioms. So yeah, as you say, I think the big problem for Platonism is the epistemological one. How do we know about the Platonic realm? Plato thought the soul existed with the forms before birth, and we recall that realm from before our birth. I don't think many of us want to take that direction. What I've been sort of playing with in the back of my mind that I may one day write on is a sort of Aristotelian Platonism, a sort of combination of Aristotle and Plato. Aristotle had these ideas that the forms, what Plato called the forms, and Plato took to be transcendent, are actually inherent in the physical world. So the universal or form of sphericity is sort of embodied in any spherical object. And so if you destroy all the spherical objects, you'll thereby destroy sphericity. So that's why on that, who is it, the great Renaissance painter, where you've got a picture of Plato pointing up and Aristotle pointing down. That was the contrast there. So in this Aristotelian, in this Aristotelian Platonism, you'd have Aristotle's view that the forms or the universals are inherent in the physical world, but Plato's view that they exist necessarily. So we disagree with Aristotle that you destroy all the physical world, you destroy all the forms. And I think that's important because I think mathematical and value truths are necessary. So whatever grounds their existence must itself exist necessarily. But if we follow Aristotle and think these forms are in here in the physical world, or maybe in our consciousness, which I think of as a sort of concrete physical thing in a way, then maybe we can be acquainted with them directly, and maybe we can learn about the form of goodness just through being directly acquainted with it embodied in our consciousness. So that's sort of roughly, and similarly with mathematical forms, maybe they're in some sense embodied in the physical universe as well as being transcendent. So I'm trying to have my cake and eat. I always trying to go for the middle ways, that they're sort of transcendent but also in the physical world. So we point up and down at the same time. But anyway, I haven't really worked out all the details of this, but that seems to me an attractive picture.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. You mentioned in the book, and you mentioned on this, in this conversation, the sort of, I guess, cultural resistance to this sort of goal directedness at the fundamental level of reality. Just in a couple of minutes, kind of, why do you think this is, and when do you think it's going to change, if it's going to change? What are the sort of, I guess, the stakes in the ground that kind of mean that people are so hesitant to begin to enjoy or view this idea, and kind of when is it, when do you think it's going to change? I mean, just to kind of spin this as well, and then leave it with you. Some good friends of mine kind of talk about the advancement of evolution happening as people die, basically, as people who are the top dogs at the moment get older and older and older, they pass away, and then evolution, as the theory can then move forwards, and we can bring in new ideas and new sort of ways of viewing things. Not that evolution is wrong, but just that we want to kind of push the paradigm and kind of explore how evolution works. And actually, sometimes we're almost capped at who's in those seats in the sort of right professorships at the right universities. We need new people to be there to allow us to begin to explore this space. Maybe the same thing is true here. I don't know. Over to you.
I have found, certainly with Panpsychism, that it's certain older members of the profession, I'm not going to mention any names, have got most irritated with it becoming a little bit more mainstream. And I remember being at one philosophy conference with a lot of older philosophers of consciousness and younger philosophers, and there was a little panel discussion at the end about what the younger philosophers. I was younger at this time. I think I'd be in the older group now. Maybe the younger side of the older group. Although Google thinks I'm 60 for some reason. I don't know how to change this. Anyway, but yeah, there was a bit of tension in the air with sort of the older philosophers thinking, oh, you talk about all this crazy stuff that we've spent ages, decades telling our students is a load of rubbish. And so I think there's a bit of truth to that. I mean, it's just always the way things work, isn't it? There's always a picture of things that people have spent a lot of time defending and put their careers on the line, and then you get a sort of culture. And I mean, I've talked a lot when talking about the book that, we all look back and we mock people in the anti-Copernicans in the 16th century, couldn't handle the evidence that we're not in the center of the universe, and with all those stupid religious people. But I think every generation does that. We're very well trained to be alert to our religious biases, but maybe less well trained to think about our secular biases. And one of my close childhood friends, John, when I talk about my wacky views, he says, "Oh, it's just your Catholic upbringing." And I just sort of think, like, my Catholic upbringing, that I sort of left when I was like a teenager, just sort of hardly has any influence on me. Whereas the secular peer group I swim in and I feel silly going against, is much more, especially in the UK, so secular, isn't it? So, yeah, I think that's part of it. What will change? I mean, it doesn't, if it still feels hard. I gave you a concrete example of we're seeing change as it's happening with the different reaction to my book, to Thomas Nagel's book, Mine and Cosmos. And, already, panpsychism's become so much more mainstream. Um, it still feels like there's a long way to go, but things do change very quickly. The trajectory on consciousness has changed so quickly. A lot of the 20th century people sort of pretended it didn't exist. And look, so I mean, to my mind, the two big things that I focus on in the book, and the two big, what's the metaphor? The two big thorns in the side of our current paradigm are fine-tuning and consciousness. I think consciousness more for philosophical reasons, as in my previous book, Galileo's Error. I think our whole scientific paradigm of the last 400 years, designed by Galileo, which has gone really well and was really good and is still really good, was premised on sort of putting consciousness outside of it. And so if we want to bring consciousness into the story, we need to rethink that somewhat. Not get rid of anything, but rethink our foundational assumptions, move to a more expansive picture. And I think panpsychism is the best way to do that. So it's more philosophical. And part of that is taking philosophy more seriously. I'm just writing something for the conversation, which is very good if people haven't come across it. Online magazine for academics to get their work to a general audience. I've written quite a few things on science and scientism I'm writing about, and how we just don't understand the point of philosophy. In a way, it's the last sort of totally disrespected academic expertise area. If people talk about, if 90% of scientists think something on a topic, that's taken very seriously. But when 90% of philosophers, sometimes you get consensus of sort of 60% of philosophers, and that's sort of meaningless. And people write these books making pronouncements on philosophy, and even if they've got no training in it and so on. So that's going to be an important part of it, getting consciousness taken more seriously. I think probably getting philosophy taken more seriously, and I think probably consciousness is going to do that, because I think we've got to take consciousness seriously to properly deal with consciousness. It's not just something we'll do a bit more neuroscience and we'll solve it. But also, I mean, the fine-tuning of physics for life, that is just straightforward scientific data, pretty uncontroversial scientific data. What is more debated is the implications of that data, where it points us towards my own view that I defend in the book is, in our straightforward, standard Bayesian ways of thinking about evidence, it is evidence for cosmic purpose. And that's somewhat debatable, but I think the reason that's so controversial is cultural reasons, So I think at some point, at some point the evidence catches up with people, and you just, more and more people want to say the emperor isn't wearing any clothes, and, it will get there in the end, and you'll suddenly think, oh my God, we're in a totally different place. Maybe. Or maybe not. Or maybe I'm totally wrong about everything. It's also possible.
You kind of build upon panpsychism in your book, and I kind of feel like it might be helpful just to kind of touch on panpsychism before we move on to the other sort of kind of premise that you put forward, which I'm going to butcher the name of consistently in this conversation. So sorry to both you, Philip, and to the audience when that happens. But anyway, we'll get to that shortly. So we are obviously kind of able to have sort of introspective moments within ourselves. I can tell you what it's like to hear your voice. I can pick up this beer that I'm drinking. I can taste it, and I can let you know what I'm tasting. And these are things that I kind of experience. And when I look at a color, for instance, I've highlighted some text for my next question that's in blue. There is a feeling that is blue-like when I look at these things. And it's very hard with our current scientific frameworks to explain some of these sort of kind of qualia phenomenon or qualities that we experience each as individuals. And if you were to look at another human being, you wouldn't necessarily be totally sure that they're also experiencing the same sort of qualia or introspective conscious properties that you are experiencing as well. You've obviously got an academic book, you've got loads of papers, you've got Galileo's error, you've gone into this tons. So just to kind of sketch the high notes, if that's okay, and then we can move forwards into these other areas of your book. Kind of, how does panpsychism, in your eyes, offer a solution to the phenomenon that is consciousness? Like, how does it begin to bring something new to the table that's going to help us to be able to get consciousness right down at the fundamental level?
Well, the thing I'm most passionate about, even more passionate about than panpsychism, connects to what we've just been talking about, namely that this is fundamentally a philosophical problem, or at least there's a core part of this that's a philosophical problem. The science of consciousness is very important, but it's not a purely scientific issue. This ancient challenge that we call the mind-body problem of how consciousness that we know about by being conscious, how consciousness and the physical world that we know about through using our senses and through doing science, how these two things fit together is a philosophical challenge. And it's a philosophical challenge because there are various hypotheses and they are all empirically equivalent, at least in certain forms, which means you can't do an experiment to distinguish between them. So one possibility is, the physical world is the fundamental thing and consciousness emerges from the physical world. That's the physicalist position. It's probably still quite dominant. The panpsychist position I prefer does it the other way around. Actually, it's consciousness that's fundamental and the physical world emerges from underlying facts about consciousness. Thirdly, you have the dualist position, probably most popular in human history and in most religions, that consciousness and the physical world are both fundamental but radically different. Still defended. The philosopher Ralph Weir has written a very good recent defense of substance dualism, and it's really interesting. The first chapter is very interesting. He just argues that basically everyone's been a dualist before recent times, and he thinks a lot of historians, there's a sort of fashion for trying to deny this, both from left and right politically. People on the left, people on the right think, dualism is really bad because it makes us just do what we want with our bodies and be very sexual and so on. Whereas people on the left say, dualism is very bad because it makes us distant from our bodies and, undermines our sexual desires. And anyway, it's very entertaining discussion of that. That was a digression. Right, so there are all these options, but you can't distinguish between them with an experiment. Each hypothesis will just, for any scientific data, each hypothesis will just interpret that data on its own terms. So you just have to do a bit of philosophy. So how can we distinguish between them? You can look at how simple they are. Scientists and philosophers want to have the simplest theory to account for the data. So I think that casts doubt on dualism on the face of it, because dualists believe in two kinds of fundamental things, the physical world and consciousness, whereas panpsychists or physicalists just believe in one kind of fundamental thing. But also you can look at explanatory success. How well do these theories do at explaining what they want to explain? The physicalist hopes to explain consciousness in terms of physical stuff. The panpsychist wants to do it the other way around, wants to explain the physical world in terms of consciousness. How well do they do? And basically, I think, the physicalist explanatory project of trying to explain consciousness in terms of neural processing in the brain has never gone anywhere, is, I think, demonstrably incoherent on philosophical grounds. Whereas the panpsychist view, we know how to do it. We've made sense of how you could account for physical reality. This is the influence of Bertrand Russell, pioneering work from the 1920s that I've talked about in various places in my book, Galileo's Error, in the new Why book. Very roughly, his idea was physics is just mathematical structure. It's just a load of math. It's like software. And so as long as you've got the right hardware, the stuff that has the right mathematical structure, you can get physics out of that. So the hardware that physics runs on could very well be consciousness stuff, consciousness hardware. As long as it has the right mathematical structure, you're going to be able to, as it were, run physics on that. So, I just think we know that it's just done so much better, the panpsychist explanatory project. So basically I think panpsychism does better than dualism in terms of simplicity, parsimony, and does better than physicalism in terms of explanatory success. And I think a large part of the reason, even though it's become more mainstream, it's still a minority position, I think, is because people think physicalism is the scientific option. But it's not, right? The scientific data is neutral on all these options. Once we treat them as just philosophical options, analyze them on those terms, I think there's a clear winner. But obviously, lots of people disagree with me.
Yeah. I was going to say there's a whole there's a whole host of podcast conversations that we could go into about this, but I wanted you to kind of sketch that because it kind of feeds quite nicely into the next bit. And just as an aside, because I'm going to butcher this word, I was recently reading Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion by Hume, who you've already mentioned, to have a chat with a friend on their podcast. And I was reading these names, Cleanthes, Philo, Dema, and I was reading this entire thing saying their names like that. And then when we eventually got to the conversation, the way they pronounced the names was totally different to the way that I pronounce the names. And I was just trying to play catch up the whole time. So you have this term that you've coined, which essentially is kind of hinting at the idea that agency has its roots at the fundamental level of physical reality. And the way I've been saying it is Pan-agentialism. So I'd like you to kind of A, tell me how I should be saying it, and I will get it wrong again, but B, also could you dive into what Pan-agentialism is and kind of why you've begun to kind of view this as the way forwards? If it's still helpful, you also in your book kind of have these sort of three levels of proto-agency, agency, and free will. I've kind of pulled those up onto a page. So if you wanted me to share my screen, I could pull that up if that's going to be helpful for you to reference. But if not, feel free to dive into this.
Perhaps, if you like, whatever you think would be helpful for your audience. What do you think?
Yeah, let me share my screen. So I'm aware that this is also an audio and video podcast. So I'm just going to kind of read out kind of what's on the screen and then I'll pass it back over to you, Philip. So we've kind of got three levels here. We've got proto-agency, which is defined as the capacity of a particle to respond to its immediate inclination to perform a specific action in the here and now. And then number two, we have agency, which is proto-agency, adding on experiential understanding. So the capacity of an organism to pursue objects of desire spread out over space and time. And then number three kind of feeds in free will. So we have proto-agency plus experiential understanding. And then we're adding in recognition of value. So the capacity of a human being to choose whether to respond to their conscious inclinations or to their value judgments. So yeah, Philip, I'll pass over to you.
Good. Yeah, that's very nice. And don't worry about pronunciation. I think people who really care about the issues don't care about pronunciation. Just people who care more about show than substance get very wound up about how you pronounce things, including the word pronunciation. So this pan-agentialist view is, I guess, taking panpsychism to another level in that not only consciousness, but also in some sense agency or proto-agency goes right down to the fundamental building blocks of reality. So in some sense, an electron is a rational agent or proto-agent. Now that sounds ridiculous at first. I had a lot of arguments, friendly discussions with the editor, who was a very good editor, Peter Moncheloff, at Oxford University Press over this. He made me introduce the word proto-agencies. It can't be talking about electrons as agents. You've got to say proto-agents, a bit more palatable. But, but as I said, I think there has been a trajectory of thinking. At first, we think, these special properties only belong to human beings. And then we eventually are willing to ascribe them to more and more of the world around us. I was interviewing on my podcast, Mind Chat, last week, the neuroscientist Kevin Mitchell, who is talking about how, he's inclined to think of cells and bacteria as agents in some sense. I'm taking it a step further. And you might think, well, how can an electron be rational? But the idea, I think rationality can come, like consciousness, can come in many different forms in human beings. Rationality is incredibly complex, the result of millions of years of evolution, involves deliberation, probabilistic reasoning, mathematics, and so on. But I think rationality can come in very simple forms. And what is possibly the simplest form of rationality is do what you feel like doing. I think that's a rational response. If I feel like having a cup of tea, then that's rational to follow that inclination to do what I feel like doing. Now, of course, if you're a statistically normal adult human being and you feel like doing something, you can think, is that a good idea? Maybe I don't want to lash out in anger. Maybe I don't want to eat this unhealthy food. But if you're cognitively quite simple, if you're a very young infant and you feel like doing something, you're going to try and do it because you don't have the cognitive resources for some more sophisticated rational response. So you respond with that very simple rational response. So on this Pan-agentialist picture, the simplest form of rationality is proto-agency, and the idea is that particles have no understanding of reality, but they have certain conscious inclinations, a very, very crude form of desire, yearning of a very, very crude form. They think like, I want to do this, and they respond rationally to that impulse, and they respond rationally to that very crude proto-desire and pursue it, right? Because they can't, they're not sophisticated enough to yield any more sophisticated rational response. So that's proto-agency at the basic level of this Pan-agentialist. I say agentialist, but you can call it how you like. Yeah, but then, so once we get evolved creatures, like a tiger, for example, that aren't just responding to, I want to do this right here, right now. They have complex needs and desires embedded in a complex understanding of reality across space and time. So the tiger wants to eat, it wants to mate, it wants to look after its offspring. And these are not just right here, right now. They're spread out over space and time, and they're embedded in a rich understanding of the environment. They understand that their mate is over here, their enemy is over there, their food is over there after they hunt it. So that blossoms into a higher level of rational responsiveness. It's responding to desire, but spread over time and mixed in with understanding of reality, which I think is also embedded in consciousness. I think our understanding of reality is embodied in our consciousness. When I look around me, it's not just colors and shapes and sounds. I see books and faces and a camera, and what these things are and mean and their significance is part of my conscious experience. This is what I call experiential understanding, and I explore in the book. So that's agency. The next stage of free will, I think, is perhaps what you only get with human beings, which is responsiveness that forms from judgments about value, right? Judgments that something is worth doing, not worth doing, that might motivate you to go against your desires. As I say, I reject the David Hume view that we're just driven by our desires. I think it's funny. So many people in my philosophical tradition just think that is obviously true, and it's incoherent to deny it. But I would want proof of that. It seems to me I can decide to do something that I don't want to do because I think I should do, or it's something more worth doing. I want to just laze around, but I think it's more worthwhile to study philosophy or something. Now people will say, "Oh, well, you have another desire to study philosophy," but why? Why think that? Why squeeze everything into that David Hume picture? Why not just say, "No, It's my judgment. My judgment about what it's better to do is what's motivating me, and not my desires. So once we get judgments about value playing a role in shaping us, I think that's where you have free will, and that's where you start to get real unpredictability. Because if I've got a very strong desire to do something that I judge I shouldn't do, either for moral reasons or for prudential reasons, I think very often it's just totally undetermined which way you're going to go with that. But I do tend to incline to the stronger libertarian free will position, although that's not an essential component of the pan-agentialist view, as I discussed in the book. You could have a more Humean version of it with just basically the first two categories.
Well, that's really interesting, especially because it seems like the consensus within philosophy, outside of philosophy, people view this as nonsense, or tend to when they realize what it is. But the sort of consensus view within philosophy seems to be sort of compatibilism, the idea that determinism is true and holds, and yet we're still agents able to utilize free will, whether that be through sourcehood or leeway, or we can get in, we probably shouldn't get into these terms, it would get really complicated, but there's sort of ways that we could define free will to kind of give us that area. So the sort of final kind of question on this before we jump into other topics I wanted to ask you is, where do you, in this view, kind of think that those cutoffs are? Obviously, everything's going to be sort of grey, right? We're going to have these sort of particles or bacteria which might have this sort of proto-agency, and then we begin to kind of build up into other animals, maybe worms that have different sorts of agency, and we get to, I would argue things like higher primates, or primates, even higher primates being us, or those of our cousins that have kind of gone extinct, even kind of maybe dogs or maybe very intelligent birds, seem to at times be able to choose a path even against their sort of experiential intuitions of what they should do, and maybe jump into a burning building and try and pull somebody out, which there are videos on YouTube of dogs doing this, for example, that why the hell would a dog do that? It's crazy, but actually there's a drive or something in it that's making it do that. So how do you view those cutoffs? Like, have you got any sort of clearly defined categories? Probably not, but I thought it'd be worth asking the question.
Probably not. I think this is, an open and an ongoing issue, and it's a partly scientific question, of course. I mean, I said a moment ago, or maybe I regret saying that already, that it's only human beings that respond to value judgments. But human beings that sort of maybe more sophisticated value judgments, ethical reasoning. I don't think dogs do kind of moral philosophy to the so I think clearly there is a step change in that regard with human beings. Obviously animals do other things better than us. But yeah, I don't want to be dogmatic and say, definitely animals never respond to value judgments. And, and as I also said, I think even doing what you feel like doing is a kind of very basic value judgment. As to where we get from category 1 to category 2, I would imagine that's, very, very early on. My hunch would be very early on with life. So, I don't think electrons have any understanding of the world. It's a difficult question. So I'm panpsychist, but I don't think literally everything is conscious. I don't think this cup is conscious. I think it's composed of conscious particles, but it's not. It doesn't itself have its own unified consciousness. It's not, in any sense, a proto-agent. But are there proto-agents? Are there proto-agents in the inanimate world? Are there beyond particles? Do particles ever combine into unified composite proto-agents before the emergence of life? It's just a very difficult question to settle because consciousness is not publicly observable. Part of the reason it's not a purely scientific question. Many physicalists these days. I was just this evening watching a talk by one of my favorite physicalists, David Papineau, who was who's coming to the opinion that, we just might not be able to settle these things about which things are conscious, because the further you get from the human position, So, in humans, maybe we can start to work out which kinds of brain activity go with consciousness. But when you start to extrapolate that to mammals, to birds, birds maybe in a sort of functional way might be in some way similar to us, but then that's realized in different physiology. Well, where does the consciousness go with the sort of functioning, or with the physiology, with the hardware or the software? How It's not obvious we can really scientifically answer those questions. I mean, I don't want to be pessimistic. Maybe we will. I'm not. I've got, but it's just very, very hard. So yeah, there are all sorts of. This is a very general framework. It's a partly scientific question how you fill in the details, and it's very, very challenging, and will certainly take hundreds of years, at least.
If you're watching this, then I just wanted to let you know that you can access the same content in audio-only form by subscribing via Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Audible. In fact, you can search for the Socratic Sessions in your favourite podcast app, and whilst you're there, please leave a 5-star review. It helps others to discover these conversations. All links are in the description, and thank you. Yeah, it's crazy. As you were speaking then, actually, we've kind of spoke about Hume quite a lot this evening, which has been quite interesting, but you were sort of reminding me of sort of some of the arguments he puts into Philo's mouth when he's talking to Cleanthes. Cleanthes is putting forward this sort of design argument, and Hume's kind of saying, but as soon as you get beyond ourselves, beyond our experiences, you begin to talk about things that are so far from us that we're just guessing as we're trying to approach these infinites and these possibilities. But we don't know yet. You're as in Cleanthes is putting these things forward as if they are correct. You just logically work this all out. But Philo is very much pushing against these things, Hume through Philo, because they're so far beyond where we are. And as you were speaking about kind of lower life forms, I'm using air quotes there for those who are listening, and sort of trying to understand kind of how consciousness is for something that isn't us. It's impossible currently to even broach that. And the sort of next question I've got, I guess, kind of feeds into the future as well. So there's a lot of talk at the moment about LLMs and AGIs, so large language models and artificial general intelligence, and kind of obviously ChatGPT's come on the scene in the last sort of 6 to 8 months, and others, Bard or Copilot or whatever. And we're sort of beginning to see these sort of large language models being a massive tool. And I think we'd be foolish to think that this is where they're going to stop, that they're not going to change and adapt and over the next sort of 100, 200 years, completely revolutionize society, ways of working, etc. I'm not making that prediction saying it's good or negative. I just think it will revolutionize in certain ways kind of where we're going. And my sort of question to you, Philip, is humans are on the scene at the moment, but they're not always going to be on the scene, no matter how you kind of, I guess, spell this out, unless you believe in a sort of God that's going to come and rescue us, I guess, from our internal destination of the heat death of the universe I mentioned near the start. Other things might be able to outlast us on hardware, disks, etc. Do things like kind of artificial intelligence, artificial general intelligence, large language models, these sorts of things add anything or subtract anything from your thesis? Could purpose and free will and agency and these things and proto-agency embodied in larger life forms, and then life forms that are able to make value decisions, you must think in some way they're going to outstrip us and we're going to be left behind eventually. Kind of how do you view that stuff? Because that's actually quite a scary conversation, but it's one that I think is lacking in a lot of the conversations online. So how do you view humanity's ultimate destination and where this thesis of yours is going long term?
That's a really good question. I guess I don't think large language models and anything like them are conscious, which is a crucial point. And part of that's to do with the Pan-agentialist view that we didn't really talk about the motivation for that. So, I mean, you're right, actually, as you said earlier, compatibilism is the majority position philosophy of mind, although there are a significant number of libertarians. No free will is actually the least popular option. You might, contrary to what you might think if you watch sort of online philosophy, Sam Harris variety. But anyway, but my motivation is for going for free will and pan-agentialism, very different from the usual motivations, which is to do with making sense of the evolution of consciousness. I think there's a challenge of why do we have consciousness at all? Even if you're a panpsychist and you think consciousness is there at the particles, why does it evolve up at the level of organisms, and why does it evolve into complex understanding and understanding of what things are and mean? And the reason that's a puzzle is because, in principle, consciousness can come apart from behavior. I think AI shows this very nicely. Actually, you get very complicated information processing, very complicated robotics without any kind of inner life at all. So why does natural selection care about consciousness? Why is natural selection bothered to give us this very complicated consciousness? And so this pan-agentialism is partly motivated by a response to that. Once we have this picture that actually we don't have this world where things are being billiard balls pushing each other around, we have this world where we have proto-agents and agents rationally responding. Well, then I think natural selection has a reason to give these proto-agents and ultimately agents complex mental lives, because they're going to respond to those complex mental lives, complex conscious understanding, and survive better and better. So it's a very layered, non-reductionist picture of things I have. Whereas I think large language models, although to a large extent, actually what's going on has got beyond the knowledge of the people who design them. Still, and I've talked to people who develop ChatGPT, sort of various AI conferences and stuff, people who work at OpenAI, we know basically that what's going on, this is sort of mechanistic, basic equations of physics. So I think where you have consciousness above the level of basic physics, we're going to have a certain sort of unpredictability, autonomy, which some scientists also take seriously, the assembly theory of Lee Cronin and Sarah Walker, who I'm hoping to meet in a few weeks if I can get over to the US, although anyway, that's a digression. Yeah. So if you think consciousness is about this kind of non-reductionist, strongly emergentist story, then you're not going to think LLMs are conscious, and so aren't going to have meaning and purpose in the way we do. However, what is also equally clear to me is that these things are radically transforming our society and and will continue to shake up and revolutionize the way we interact with each other, the way we are connected to the world around us. And perhaps out of that, the next stage of humanity will emerge. So not because the AIs are going to take over or we're going to upload or something, but just because that transformation of our physical existence will allow new forms of interaction, new forms of consciousness. And yeah, I envisage perhaps that. I mean, this is all very uncertain, very speculative, but that might be where the sort of, as it were, next stage of cosmic evolution emerges from.
It's fascinating, isn't it? There's obviously this story within religion around good versus bad, around this idea of God and his army coming against evil and sin and its negativity on the world and waging war. And there's sort of a kind of classic Christian idea. I use the sort of Christian terminology because that's the one I'm most familiar with, is the idea that we're in this sort of shadowland, that we're in the place that that is going to win the victory, but actually ultimately we have to navigate this life and this path ourselves and try and figure out how we can do the most good with where we are. The kind of idea of good versus evil, I think when I was reading your book, I kind of felt like you could almost argue that good is this sort of pan-agentialism. I can't even say the word now. Anyway, your view and the view of sort of kind of physicalism, and these two things kind of, I don't know whether it's possible to view like this, but being in tension. And the reason why I kind of suggest this is because if you look at the sort of let's call it the tree of life, the evolutionary tree that we're aware of. There are obviously many branches that we're not aware of currently, but those that have been found in the fossil record and sketched out for us, if you were to actually put that tree up on a hill and shine the sun behind it so you could just see the shadow of the tree in front of you, that tree would be in tatters, like absolute ruins, like massive swaths have been ripped away as massive cataclysmic events. I think there have been 5, right, kind of wiped out most of life, and then life's emerged from there, which is fascinating in and of itself. But this sort of idea, I guess, is that there have been many avenues for conscious creatures to whatever level to be beginning to engage with sort of value, or at least expressing ways of kind of moving forwards within their experiential frameworks, to have been annihilated essentially through usually kind of very horrific ways. And I guess my sort of question is kind of, we speak as if we're on this trajectory towards a goal that the universe is going in, and that it's a positive direction. But at the same time, I could very much imagine that tomorrow a nuclear war takes place because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, for instance. There are many things that could happen. I'm not saying that will, but it's a possibility, right? We need to have that on the cards. So with the sort of historical fact that we have these conscious creatures, the sort of good that I mentioned before, beginning to outplay and grow into higher and higher forms of kind of agents, and also this sort of kind of physical reality, and we can call this physicalism if we want, but just the sort of dominant reality that actually everything seems to end in disaster or death. I guess it's the problem of evil that I'm kind of throwing back at you, and kind of, we spoke about this before, but kind of saying, does this sow any seeds of doubt or any seeds of threat into this idea of pan-agentialism? Like, does it begin to disrupt this sort of view that there is a fundamental value, because it seems to almost eat its own tail at certain times? Or can we honestly see a trajectory where this thing's going to continue on to a sort of meaningful place? Maybe I'm viewing this incorrectly. I'm viewing this as it has to last indefinitely, as I mentioned before, the sort of theistic view. Maybe it is just the fact that we get to partake, which means that value fundamentalism is correct. So I've said a lot of words there, Philip, so I'll just pass it back to you to kind of muse on those thoughts.
No, these are really good places to probe. I mean, I would say I don't necessarily disagree with a lot of that. I think pan-agentialism or cosmic purpose doesn't mean it's all going to end happily ever after. And I think, to my mind, the universe as we experience it is a mixture of accident and design, a funny cocktail of the two. And some things seem like the fine tuning, like I talk about psychophysical harmony in the book, which we haven't quite got into, but is related to some of the evolutionary issues I've just been talking about. So some things seem improbably good against the odds, like the fine tuning, most obviously. How come we got the right numbers for life against improbable odds? But some things seem arbitrary and gratuitous and horrific and meaningless and pointless, and the immensity of outer space. And so I think the traditional atheists have problems accounting for the former, the traditional theists have problems accounting for the latter, and to my mind we just need a hypothesis that can account for both. I've enjoyed the recent output of YouTuber Emerson Green, who started off as a teenage new atheist and is still an atheist, but has slowly begun to take much more seriously these things that seem improbably good in reality, and had a recent video on Am I Now Agnostic? But yeah, so I mean, I think, pan-agentialism, I mean, look, pan-agentialism is totally consistent with horrible things and horrible cancer and so on. Obviously it has to be, because these things are real. But what explains that would be that, the particles, let's say the particles underlying cancer, they don't know what they're doing, right? They're not bad. They're just pursuing their desires they don't understand what's going on. They're just doing the rational thing given what they know. And yeah, I think there is some kind of force or purpose or directedness. Shouldn't say force, should that sound sort of a bit wishy-washy? That fine-tune the universe, right? We could how much influence does that force have? We don't know. I try out various possibilities. So and to the extent that my book ends, the final chapter of the book is more, what does this mean for humans and human meaning and purpose? To the extent that it ends on a positive note, it's because I argue that to a degree it can be rational to hope beyond the evidence. I like William James, who in his great paper The Will to Believe, that he later called thought he should have called, and I agree with him, the right to believe. He talks about where there's great uncertainty, to an extent it can be rational to hope or even believe beyond the evidence. If you've got, think about climate change. If you're just going off the evidence, you should probably think we're not gonna deal with this, or at least think you shouldn't be confident that we will. But perhaps it can be rational to think, look, I believe we're going to make it. I'm choosing. I'm not denying the facts. But I'm choosing. I'm choosing to live in hope that we're going to make this, and that's going to give me meaning and motivation. And James talks about quite vividly about you're lost in the mountains and you've got to jump this huge chasm. And if you're just thinking about the evidence, you think I'm probably not going to make it, but you can think, I believe I'm going to make this, and that's if you can do that, you've probably got more chance of making it. So I think in my cosmic purposivism, there's another hard word for anyone to pronounce. Insofar as I've come to find meaning through that, it's partly about hope. Maybe it's gonna all come to disaster, but I think it's very uncertain, and it can be rational to hope that we are going to get to a better place. Maybe not for eternity. Maybe the universe will reach some wonderful fruition and then pass out of existence. But there is some greater reality to come, and seeing the good we do as contributing in some small way to that greater hope. And it may be a load of bollocks, but you only live once, and if things are very uncertain, and choosing to live in hope of certain things can give you meaning and purpose, then I think that's all for the good.
Yeah, it's so interesting, the kind of way you talk about the sort of fine-tuning of the universe. Obviously, most people, when they think about this, believe that there needs to be a powerful force to set the parameters to enable life to even come into fruition to start with. But then at the same time, if it is a bubbling from the bottom of goal directedness, you've almost got to ask kind of like, how does that and the parameters being fine-tuned, it's almost like this is higher level purpose and this lower level purpose kind of coming into a coalition of sorts to push us forwards. Anyway, this is probably one to kind of pick up in a future conversation. I have two final questions for you. I'm aware we're pushing time, so I kind of wanted just to touch base on, you mentioned the last chapter of your book about sort of human purpose going forwards, and you kind of mentioned your Catholic roots originally, how you left Catholicism, much to family members' dismay, I believe, and then you were sat in a cathedral recently, or I say recently, in the book you were saying it's recently, it might have been a few years ago now, but talking to a priest or a vicar of some sort, and kind of thinking again about the role that religion has to play. I'd just like to kind of get your sort of thoughts on sort of what you think religion can offer against these sort of realities. I view them quite starkly, but others don't. So what do you think the role of religion is against the stark realities of the world as we find it?
Yeah, I think we we tend to think of religion as all about belief, don't we? And we call religious people believers, and religion does involve belief, and there's a place for thinking about how plausible those beliefs are. But I think it can be a bit myopic to just focus on beliefs when there's so much more to religion. There's tradition, there's ritual, forms of practice that bind the community together across space and time, that mark the changing of the seasons and the rites of passage, the big moments of life, birth, coming of age, marriage, death. I think, it's a huge experiment to just think, oh, we can do without all of that, especially when there are such powerful forces in the modern world, global capitalism, advertising, the ways in which these things can fragment communities. So, I think there's potential to engage. So I do engage with Christianity with my local church, and I find great meaning in the symbolism of Christianity, identifying God with the naked executed peasant rather than the king in the castle, that sort of turning upside down of worldly values that inspired the 14th century peasant revolution and the civil rights movement. And I've been reading Tom Holland's book Dominion about how Christianity shaped the modern world on a purely historical level. This idea of the poor and the weak having inherent value that was so weird in the Roman Empire. Like, what we have to, poor people have value? What the hell are you talking about? Because essentially God became poor, God was executed as a peasant. That powerful idea. And how Romans, if you didn't want your baby, just stick it on the rubbish dump, and then Christians come along and say, maybe not a great idea. So I think there's great foresight. Actually, well, in my local church, they asked me, to come and talk once a month. They get someone to come and talk about, their faith or whatever. And I was like, God, people are going to think I'm a heretic or something, that I kind of, I don't have very traditional beliefs. But then someone else who goes to the church, my colleague in the physics department at Durham Uni, doesn't believe anything. He was thinking, saying, "Oh, what's all this cosmic purpose mumbo jumbo?" He's sort of even less of a believer than me. He just sort of has some sort of vague sense of a transcendent reality without anything more concrete than that, which is actually really the Catholicism of my father, actually, that I was kind of raised on. So I guess I was raised actually a kind of non-believing Catholic, for the sense of some spiritual reality, and the importance of tradition and the values of Christianity and so on. But never much emphasis on the specific beliefs. So I guess in a long roundabout way, that's where I've come back to, really. With the Church of England rather than the Catholic Church, I think sort of tends to have a little bit more flexibility. You give the very conservative evangelical bits, you've got the very high Catholic, but you kind of run-of-the-mill Anglican Church. You can interpret things how you want, I think.
Well, that's why it was designed, so you can divorce your wife. Sorry, I'm joking. That's a cheap shot.
Oh yeah, I think that's probably why, actually. That's why I like. It wasn't set up with a big ideology behind it. It was just the king wanted a divorce. So yeah,
quite possibly. Okay, so I'd love to hear what your current endeavours are and kind of how you believe that they contribute to the advancement of universal purpose.
Yeah. So I've just started giving a new talk when I get invited to departments and conferences and stuff, which I hope eventually to write up as a paper on. Well, I've just been getting close to religion there and fine tuning and all that, but this is a conceivability argument against God that I'm giving this week in Liverpool, actually, my hometown. Yeah, this is something, that I thought lots of atheists has already made. And everyone I spoke to thought, oh, loads of people have made this argument. But actually, you look into it, no one has. The last time it was made in a paper was 1948. And A.C. Grayling has sort of touched on this very briefly, but there hasn't really been a systematic defense of this idea. So, well, we have conceivability arguments in philosophy of mind. Can you conceive of a zombie that's physically just like us but has no consciousness? And if that's conceivable, if it's kind of coherently imaginable, does that mean it's possible? And that's potentially has implications in philosophy of mind. Well, I've been thinking of, it seems you can conceive of the non-existence of God. You can conceive of a world without God. And if you think that means, well, that's possible, well, then that's a problem for God, because God's supposed to exist necessarily, supposed to exist in all possible universes. So you get a sort of argument against God. And I think this is interesting because a lot of theists argue for dualism on the basis of these conceivability arguments. Quite interesting if they also can be used to rule out the existence of God. But yeah, but I've got a kind of nuanced view. What I ultimately end with the paper is leaving open the possibility of the apophatic conception of God, where God is just beyond human understanding. Whereas what I'm ruling out is a conscious God. What Brian Davies called theistic personalism. God as a sort of big mind, which I guess in the public people think that is what God is. But there's always been also the apophatic tradition in all of the Abrahamic faiths that God isn't a big mind. God is beyond human understanding. Beyond everything we can say about God is negative. Right back to the early church fathers like Origen and Gregory of Nyssa and so on. And I think, yeah, I mean, just relating this to the big questions, if I do take seriously the question, why does the universe exist? Why is there something rather than nothing? It would be at least nice to have a satisfying answer to that. But just postulating a big mind doesn't seem to me to help, because you've got the natural question, well, why does that big mind exist? It's a sort of go-to objection of the teenage new atheist, but I think there's something to it, and so I think if there is a God of some kind that can potentially offer a satisfying explanation to why there's something rather than nothing, I think such a thing would have to be totally beyond human understanding. It would have to be the kind of thing where if you came face to face with it, you just say, oh my God, that has to exist. Wow. But I don't think anything humans have a grasp of, including consciousness, is like that. So yeah, so anyway, that was very long-winded, but the paper is sort of arguing against God as a big mind, but leaving open the possibility, not arguing for, but leaving open the possibility of the God of the apophatic tradition, God beyond human understanding. So sorry, that was a bit long-winded. I'm really excited about a new project,
Yeah.
And hopefully I'll write that up as a paper at some point.
That's really
But
awesome.
This is the first podcast I've talked about it on, actually.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
So it's just a new thing.
That's an honor. It's an honor. Okay, so in regards to you've got obviously your book Galileo's Error, you've got your book Why, which are the popular books. You have some academic books, got your papers. You have your Mind Chat podcast, you've got Twitter, you've got your website. Is there anywhere else that people should be checking you out, Mr. Goff?
I did set up a Substack, but I don't tend to do it much because, I tend to just try and get something published in a magazine or something, and then I end up not publishing.
Fair play,
yeah. So Philip_Goff, spend too much time on it. I am about to do my first TikTok.
Very nice.
People think this is a terrible idea, but I sent it to my teenage nieces and they didn't reply for about 48 hours. And I was thinking, oh God, they think it's terrible.
That's fantastic.
But then they did get back to me, said they thought it was really good.
Nice.
I might at some point, I don't know, nothing exciting, just me. Prof Goff, Prof Goff
Nice.
on.
I like it.
I don't know what the exact handle is. I don't know. I'm not really used to TikTok yet, but yeah, I might send out the occasional TikTok. I'm adding more things for me to do, aren't I? But anyway,
that's the way the world goes. There's always more. But one day AI will do it for us, right? That's the dream. Anyway, I'll make sure there are links to all of that in the description. So listener, viewer, check those out. And Philip, as always, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you. Thank you so much, my friend.
Likewise. Thank you very much, Samuel. It's been a really stimulating conversation. Take care.
Thanks for checking out this episode. Please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. And make sure you check us out over on Locals. Cheers.